Brace yourselves, everyone, because I'm about to get into something a little bit controversial. I hope it's not too offensive a thing to say that this fellow right here did some rather nasty things during his lifetime. Now, of course, I'm being very much facetious when I say that sort of thing, because no person in their right mind, no decent person at least, would question the fact that the individual who was responsible for millions upon millions of deaths, being innocent people, did some, at least rather dubious things during his or her lifetimes. Seems like a rather plainly stated, obvious, and unquestioned even fact. But there does seem to be a sense in some historical circles, not of Nazism, I'm not claiming that, but there does seem to be a sense, rather, that we cannot judge the actions of the past, which seems rather inconsistent in its viewpoints. And in fact, I don't think that people genuinely really hold to that idea. They're just very, very careful about how they apply morality to the past, but that's good. We'll get to that in a bit. So, first off, let's just take the blanket idea, which I understand, it's a bit of a straw man, but the blanket idea that we cannot judge the past. Well, of course, that's horribly inconsistent because we do end up judging the modern day. You know, we judge current actions very readily. In fact, you know, I'll put up two pictures here, be you on one side of the room or on the other. Odds are you have a lot of things to say about the other person and their morality, perhaps. But according to the idea, which again, not saying that anybody really holds to this on a hardline basis, but we'll just set it up as the extreme and we'll backtrack from there. Compare this to the idea that we cannot judge the past, and it would seem to say that, well, we can certainly judge these two individuals now, but as we get further and further away from their actions, they become somewhat untouchable. They become simply products of their time that we cannot really judge because we weren't there, we weren't in their shoes, we don't know the context, we don't all these different things. Somehow they become less and less able to be touched. Now, when it comes to people like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Mao, all these different individuals, well, we seem very, very ready to judge them as bad people. Rather than a few people, you know, on the fringes of society, most people readily accept the fact that these people did bad things. Now, whether or not they're bad people, that's something different, which we'll get to in a few minutes here. But they did bad things. But the issue becomes much more complex when we begin to talk about more, shall we say, morally less obvious, although I don't think any figure is morally obvious in that way. But when we get to more, shall we say, mixed reputation type figures throughout history. Now, a very common example of this sort of idea of whether or not we can judge people in the past would be, at least in the United States, someone like George Washington. Now, George Washington is held up in the United States, at least in popular culture, as something of a paragon. He is an exemplar of virtue, of dignity, and of everything, so to say, that every American should strive to be. Whether or not he was is, of course, a very different question, but he's held up in this sort of, you know, this sort of founding role. He is, well, yes, he is in fact one of the founders of the nation. He is the father of everyone who belongs there, and all that sort of thing, you know, very Whiggish, nationalistic type sense. But there's always another group of people out there who point out the fact, you know, he wasn't really all that good of a man. You know, he had slaves, after all. Oh my god, you're right. He must have been completely evil. It's a horrible figure. Why do we follow him at all? He is absolutely terrible. We can't listen to him on anything at all because he was an awful, horrible, horrid racist. Of course, how can it be any different? The man held slaves, and purely because of the color of their skin. If that's not racist, I don't know what is. And it's that sort of argument, that sort of perspective, which I understand is very much a straw man in and of itself, but you see, we're building a basis here, we're building a basis. It's that sort of argument, that sort of perspective that people who say things like we cannot judge the past look at when they make that claim. Then when they say things like he was just acting within his time, we can't really say that he's a bad person because he did something which is bad to our modern day standard. That's a bit closer to the position that people genuinely hold when they say things like we cannot judge the past. They're not saying that, you know, Hitler did nothing wrong because he was simply acting within his context, but rather they're saying it is inappropriate to take the morality of the present and apply it retroactively to the past, as if to say that we are the most pure beings and everyone else before us is just, tosh. Which, of course, that does seem to hold some truth to it, because it doesn't really make any sense to say something like, well, George Washington held slaves, therefore he was a bad person, because, well, of course, what about all the other things that they did in life? In fact, if we were to say something like holding slaves makes you a bad person, full stop, as a whole, on the whole, then, in fact, a great majority of the people throughout history are all of a sudden very, very bad people. And we only really begin to see truly virtuous individuals either in the lowest classes, in the most poor classes of society who just weren't able to have slaves, or even in those individuals who would be fighting slavery in, you see, more the Georgian and Victorian eras. Now, it doesn't exactly seem right to say that there were only moral people after the Victorian era, because of course, even many of those people who were fighting so adamantly for the abolition of the slave trade were, by modern day standards, very, very racist people. They said things like, it's the white man's burden to go out and free the enslaved, negroid underspecies who can't really help themselves. It's up to us, the more virtuous, manly, and all these different things, to sort of go down. It's up to the white population to go down and pull these people up to our level so that they can enjoy the fruits of our success and all this sort of, a lot of that sort of thought was very common in the Victorian era. Well, that's highly racist. If I were to say something like that nowadays, of course, rightly so, that would be deemed rather morally reprehensible. So it seems to be at least a little bit off to take modern day morality, modern understandings of various concepts, and applying it to the past, use it as sort of a test to see whether or not a person was moral, whether or not a person was good or not. The same sort of logic applied to other fields, say science and mathematics, technology, things like that, would be to say that, well, of course, every single physician who came around, before Paris medicine or something like that in the early 1800s was just an absolute moron. Whereas, no, they very clearly were not. An individual, just because they thought that letting blood was a cure for particular illnesses, just because they were wrong about that doesn't mean that they were stupid or that they were unintelligent individuals. They were, of course, dealing with the best of what they had at the time, and, I think that we can say they were actually quite smart. But they were still wrong. I think that we can take that same exact logic, and I think that we commonly do this, we just don't often phrase it in such a way. We can take that same sort of logic of the person, again, we'll use the physician who's letting blood as an example, an immensely intelligent man, he's been to Oxbridge and he's done all the appropriate training and, he knows all the books and everything, and he's convinced that if I let blood out of this individual, then it will help to cure their fever because it's balancing out the humors and such. Now, while we can say that the individual, while we can say that their action, the action of letting blood, actually was harming the individual, and it was not the right thing to do, that particular instance, they did the wrong thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that the individual, while they were wrong, it does not mean that they were unintelligent or that they are, stupid in any way. So how do we connect this to morality and judging morality in the past? Well, I say that we absolutely can judge the past, but it is on a very careful basis that we do so. So we can say something like, say, George Washington holding slaves was in fact a bad thing. The fact that he owned other people as property is a bad thing to do. It is a morally reprehensible thing. But that George Washington himself, as an individual, as a man, was not necessarily a bad person for the owning of slaves, given the context that he was in. Now, this is where it gets a little bit precarious, because we get dangerously close to an idea of moral relativism, with the idea that we cannot judge the individual, that no matter what the person does, they are somehow blameless because they are doing it within the context of their time, while the action that they do is wrong, well, we can't blame them at all. It's a sort of moral relativism, and I want to stress that that is not what I'm advocating here. Rather, what I'm arguing is that the morality of an action and the morality of an agent are two distinctive and separable calculations to be made, so to say. It's a rather utilitarian way of looking at it, but the morality of an action and of the agent performing that action are two separate things. Now, this is hardly a new idea in philosophy, and I'll see if I can link some articles down in the description below if you're interested in reading about this sort of moral issue. It's very contentious in various philosophic fields and scholastic journals and such. So, a very common example that we have floating around in those sorts of philosophic discussions is that of good General Eisenhower and evil General Eisenhower. So, General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in the Second World War, and as a result, one of the figures responsible for the Omaha landings, or the D-Day landings as they're most commonly known, in the Second World War to liberate France from Nazi occupation. So now, I think that we can, across the board, say something like, well, the liberation of occupied France from the Nazis. Well, that's a good thing. That is a good thing to do. It's a good intention, good end. It's good. It's a good, honorable thing to do. General Eisenhower, on the other hand, wanted to, presumably at least, do that exact thing. He put forward this action, he proposed this action, in order to liberate France, which is a good thing. I think that we can say, morally speaking, for him, that was a good thing for him to do. Let's pretend, though, that rather than General Eisenhower's intention being to liberate and save France from the Nazis, now of course he's still going to do this. The action itself of the Omaha invasion remains the same throughout this. So he's still liberating the French. But let's pretend rather than wanting to save the French, or rather than his intention being to liberate France from the Nazis, he thought to himself, right, well, they all think that I want to do this thing, and they all want to do that thing, so sure, we'll go along with that. But the way that I'm really getting my kicks, he's saying to himself, is by killing off as many American and British soldiers as I possibly can. Now, of course, that's a rather bad thing to do, isn't it? That's a rather morally repugnant, evil thing. Much the same way I should think that we can say holding slaves is a rather bad thing to do. But the action itself of the Omaha invasion, is that suddenly corrupted because of the intention with which it was made? Now, we'll assume here that the actual invasion is carried out in the same way in both cases. There's no sort of like little, oh, I'll make the landing over here fail so that way more than die. No. General Eisenhower is smart, whether he's, good Eisenhower or evil Eisenhower, and he realizes, right, this has to go pretty well, otherwise they'll fire me and I won't get to kill any more people. So he makes it sure that it is carried out in the best way, whether or not his intention is to liberate France or not. So the action is the same. The only thing that's different is the intention of General Eisenhower. Is he then somehow corrupting the action itself purely through his intention? Does his intention, possibly being, to kill a bunch of people, does that corrupt somehow the action itself of liberating the French? Does that suddenly make Nazi occupation seem somehow better? I don't think it does. I'm sorry, that was a very long-winded way of being able to finally get to this conclusion, but I don't think that it does. While we can say at that point that General Eisenhower's intention was a negative thing or a bad thing, it did not affect the morality of the action. The two are completely separate and distinct things. So let's have another example, and I promise you this one will be much, much shorter. But let's have another example, and let's reverse it a little bit to where the action is bad, but the intention of the individual is good. Say little Johnny is walking along, and he has 2 balloons, and he's very happy with these balloons, because of course they're bright and shiny, they float. I mean, it's incredible, they float. Balloons are fantastic things to have. And he sees little Sally walking down the way, and he thinks, oh, well, little Sally, oh, poor little Sally doesn't have any balloons at all. I know, is what he says to himself. I'm going to be a good person. I'm going to give little Sally one of my balloons because I am selfless, I am good, and I want to spread the joy that is, what's the word for floating? Ballooniness. He wants to spread ballooniness. So, he gives little Sally the bright red balloon. But, as it turns out, while his intention was wholly good, while I think that we can say that little Johnny is a very, very good little boy for giving the balloon, little Sally, as it turns out, has an extreme phobia of bright, shiny, red, floating balloons. And And so he hands a balloon to her, and she begins screaming and bawling her eyes out. The balloon goes into the air, and it's just a horrible scene all around. Well now, little Johnny had only the purest of intentions at heart, but the action which he perpetrated was overall a negative thing. It only created badness. It made him feel bad, made Sally feel bad, lost the balloon, it's gonna pop somewhere, makes a balloon feel bad. So I think that we can say that overall his deciding to give the balloon to little Sally was a bad decision to make, while his intention was by no means a negative thing, and we can certainly say that in fact he's little, what was it, Johnny? Johnny something. Well, I think that we can say that he is a good person overall, despite having done something which really only caused pain and suffering. It wasn't his intention. This, of course, assumes a rather utilitarian way of looking at the world, but, well, my goodness me, utilitarianism is a bit of a broader topic, and it's something that we can discuss at a later point. This video was supposed to be about judging the past. Let's get back to that, shall we? So I don't think that nowadays anybody out there, at least any really decent people, and I apologize if I offend any of you, staunch slavery proponents out there, but I don't think any decent people would really say anything other than slavery is basically a bad thing. In principle, the idea of owning another person as property is a bad thing. No one would really question that these days. But it is another thing altogether then to take that fact that slavery is bad and then say, as a result of that, every person in the past who had slaves was a bad person. Instead, to judge the action of the individual is a much more complex thing to do. In the case of someone like, say, Adolf Hitler, it's it's a much easier thing to do in that he literally wrote a biography about, everything that he wanted to do. He revealed a bit more of his true character there than many people in history actually end up doing. In order to judge an individual, whether or not the individual is good or bad, depending on their actions, is an immensely difficult thing to do. It requires an almost a totality of knowledge of the context which surrounded them, as well as their entire life stories to know sort of, what was going on inside of them, what was their perspective during the whole thing. And it is that which is required to judge whether an individual is morally good or bad. There's a reason why the saying, judge the sin, not the sinner, is a very, very popular statement. So am I saying that we cannot judge people in the past as being morally bad or morally, shall we say, lacking in some capacity? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. It is absolutely possible to do, but it is also an immensely difficult task to undertake. It requires a very, very complete and full understanding of the individual, who they were, and the context that surrounded them. It's not enough to just say, oh, well, Cecil Rhodes, look at how he talked about black people. Clearly, he was a racist, he was a bad person. Well, no, because you have to also understand, the entirety of how society perceived race at the time, and look at how he interacted with that perception, things like that, to understand whether or not he was genuinely, so to say, a racist, as we use the term now. It is possible to judge the past, but it is a very difficult thing to do. And we begin to see the problems, of course, when people take this idea that we can judge the past and they apply it very loosely, very readily to approve or to support their modern day political concerns. So, I suppose one of these days I'll learn how to make one of these videos short and to the point, but until that time, dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants. He wrote the song, and yet it became one of these